Hello, welcome back to Getting Into TV. I'm Tom, and this is your hub, I suppose, of where you can learn all about getting into TV, both scripted and unscripted. This week, I'm joined by the amazing Michelle Ackerley, who I am very grateful for you wanting to come on and chat about what you do. So thank you.
No, thank you. I'm very excited to be a part of your podcast, Tom.
I mean, we've worked together for 6 years now, which is crazy to think.
Has it been that long? It's been a while,
been
hasn't
that long.
it?
6 years since I started. But obviously, you work on things like Crimewatch Live and Morning Live. You're a presenter, is what you do. But I want to take you right the way back. Is what got you into TV? What was it that made you think that this is what I want to do? And did you always want to be a presenter?
It's a really interesting question, that one, because actually, if I rewind all those years ago when I was in sixth form, I was studying psychology at A level, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I really tapped into learning more about human behavior. And with psychology, it was kind of putting a framework behind an interest in terms of almost the science and the structure around brain development, body language, essentially what makes people tick from the past to the present to the future. At that point, I didn't necessarily know that that was going to form a connection into TV and then into TV presenting. So I ended up going to Manchester University and doing a degree in psychology. And it was actually in my second year of university. I saw a poster on the wall when I was walking into the psychology building, and it was for a talk with a couple of representatives, really, and a couple of presenters from the media industry with all different backgrounds. There were a couple of radio hosts from what was Key 103, so an old Manchester station. And then various people that worked within telly, like yourself, you know, APs, producers. I thought, that sounds really interesting. I'd like to know more about what this industry is and what these people do. So I remember going into the lecture hall in my lunch break, and I sat there for 45 minutes, an hour, however long it was. And I walked out of that space feeling so inspired and being like, oh my gosh, I want to work within this industry. I don't necessarily know what I want to do yet, but I want to be a part of that. It was the creativity and seeing there was like probably 5 or 6 people sat on this panel at the front of the lecture hall. Not one of them looked the same, and they were all dressed differently, and they all had different accents and something different to say. And I thought, that for me kind of sums up the tapestry, really, of human behavior, if you like, if you kind of link it back to psychology. And I thought, this is actually something more than a psychological study that I want to explore more. So that kind of really set me off on my journey into telly. I applied for a work experience placement at the BBC and ended up getting it. I went for the interview and got 4-week work experience placement at Manchester Oxford Road in the entertainment department on the 4th floor. And that was basically how it started. But at that stage, I didn't know it was presenting that I was going to end up in, you know. It was still quite a road from that point. I started within documentaries. So I worked as a runner logging tapes for an amazing chap, documentary maker called Richard Mesa. He did a documentary at the time called The Secret Life of the Shop. And I found him fascinating because he was almost like an armchair psychologist. He would study people, watch them and film them. And he would ask them really pertinent questions and pause and wait for their response. And if they didn't quite answer in a kind of, you know, a really full way, he wouldn't say anything. He would just let that space kind of breathe. And you'd realize that there's that kind of thing that we have inbuilt within us, where if someone stops talking, someone else feels like they're compelled to kind of fill that space. And I thought, that's so fascinating. I just felt like I was learning more things that kind of dipped into that kind of psychological world, but within a TV framework. So I worked as a runner on various shows, Mastermind, Question of Sport, Dragon's Den. Then I moved down to London I applied for a research position on Blue Peter, which was down in London at the time before it moved to Manchester, and worked as a researcher on Blue Peter. And my role within that show was to come up with all the studio makes and bakes. Let's make a dog bed out of an old jumper, or a money box from, an old...
What era was this?
This was going back to the 2010.
I was still watching. I was still watching all this.
There
Yeah,
you
I was
go.
still
Yeah.
watching all this.
Some of those studio makes that you saw, I came
Yeah.
up with those ideas.
You're the reason my mom was having to go out to, Asda and get all this stuff for me.
Exactly. But it was so much fun, and there was so much creativity there. And I remember, one of the makes that I did was making a dog bed out of an old jumper. And every Friday we would have to go into the editor's office and pitch our ideas. And I very quickly learned that actually, if you present your idea to the editor as if, okay, imagine this, and one of the presenters is going to come on and say this, and I just present it really rather than read it off some notes. And it was that kind of moment I was thinking, I quite like this. And I think one of the editors at the time was like, she's quite good at that. And he must have just been bored one day. I know my very good friend now, Helen Skelton, who randomly we now work on Morning Live together, but she was off doing one of her amazing, fabulous challenges. I think she was rowing the Amazon at the time, and I'm making dog beds out of old jumpers. And Tim, the editor, said, you know what, Michelle, would you like to present your item on Blue Peter this afternoon? Because actually, you know it better than anybody in terms of what you're talking about. And I think you'd be good at it. And I remember thinking, oh my God, that was my very, very first little stint of presenting on Blue Peter, doing a little kind of studio segment. And it was basically from there that things started to slowly but surely go from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. And I loved every minute of it. For me at that time, it was still kind of like that journey of exploration and kind of trying to figure out, what is it that I like about this? What do I want more or less of? And, still working in production as well as doing bits and pieces of presenting. But yeah.
What was it about? I mean, I love that story. I mean, I remember Helen on the Amazon, so I remember that time. So,
Yeah.
which is pretty cool. But like, just before we get on to like you presenting, what was it? Your time in production behind the scenes, how do you think that helped you in them early days, or even now? Like, has that helped you as a presenter?
Yeah, it really has. I think, working in production, I think, is a really tough job. And, the likes of you, when you've got people, and I notice it all the time from the amount of productions that I've worked on as a presenter and also in production, when you see people that are very good at their job, it's commendable. I look at you on Crimewatch, think he's got this nailed here, because I think a part of it, obviously, you're constantly working against a deadline, a changing deadline. The whole, everything could be changing all in one go. And I think what I learned was how important it is to obviously be quick thinking, but take the time to observe. So when I used to work on Blue Peter, for example, I would constantly be observing the presenters, little things like, for example, when Helen or AO, one of the other presenters at the time, or Joel, when they'd be doing a piece to camera, and everything there was no auto cue for Blue Peter, it was just live, and they would have to remember everything.
Wow.
They would deliver their piece to camera, and then it would go on to the next presenter. But they'd always make sure that they would hold their eye line to the camera for a few seconds after they'd finished what they were going to say. And little things like that, that's amazing. They'd make sure that they'd engage with the audience and not just kind of move their eye movement as soon as they stopped speaking. Like we kind of, and my eyes are all over the place normally when I'm just chatting. So it's little things like that. And also within production, writing a script, it's so important. And you really have to put yourself into that position of who is reading a script, who's going to be delivering it, and really thinking through the different personalities, but the different types of production. For example, presenting on something like Crimewatch, and the way the tone and delivery is going to be very different to presenting on a kids' TV program. So from my time in production, those skills that I was able to develop from coming up with the ideas for things that you think would work for different presenters, especially in kids' TV, that to certain presenters going to really give it their energy and give it their all, honing those ideas, to tailoring scripts and thinking carefully about the tone and the energy and the jokes and the seriousness, is something that is definitely, it's massively, and it continues to help me all the time. And even, from my point of view as a presenter now, the world is constantly changing. What's hot and what's not is constantly changing. And you need to be able to change with the times and adapt and evolve. And within that, it's important to be constantly thinking about new ideas.
Yeah.
And what, I guess it's almost going back to like psychology. What do I find interesting about that? How do other people react to that? And what voice can I bring to it? Which is something, especially in a development space in production that you do. But I feel like if you're going to have longevity as a presenter, you need to be able to do as well. You need to be able to be thinking about what's the next thing that you could be doing. What can you offer? How can you think about this in a different way? And good production staff have got that skill.
No, I completely get what you mean. And it's funny what you say actually about writing the scripts and tailoring them to different people, because when I'm writing the scripts before they get signed off, I do have you and Rav
Yeah.
just in my head, and I'm like, I know how you'd say it. It's
Yeah.
weird how it just comes to you after a few times.
Yeah.
But I think one thing is also, like, I don't know if you kind of said it earlier with your interest in psychology and people. One big thing about just working in telly, I think, is that interest in people, and that's what gets you
Mm-hmm.
further and further, because you have that, because it's all about building relationships. And I
Yeah.
don't know if you found that.
Massively. I think that is what it comes down to, really, within the bare bones of it, and I get a lot of people contacting me sometimes on a daily basis, especially on, socials, and they say that they'd like to become a presenter. And the first question I always ask is, why? And at the heart of that, it's got to be an interest in people. It's got to be an element of curiosity about something. It could be anything, but there's got to be that passion for asking questions, curiosity and wonder. And as you said, you've got to be interested in people. You've got to want to connect and communicate. And when I say communicate, that doesn't mean you have to be a really chatty, gregarious person. Because if I'm honest, I'm actually quite shy in groups of people. I'm not very good, like in a big group of people.
Very much the same.
I much prefer to be one-on-one and to get to know somebody. I can present in a space where I need to, but that isn't my comfort zone. No. So it's kind of, being a presenter doesn't mean that you have to be the life and soul of the party, be the chattiest person in the room. But being a good communicator, can come in different forms, and you do have to have that intrinsic interest in people. And I learned that pretty early, because I remember, again, going back to Richard Mason, the documentary maker that I worked with, and I'm sure he would say it himself, but he's got quite an awkward demeanor about him, very shy, painfully shy at points, but he was able to bring out such a depth of interest within people through his personality, and that's because he was just he was so interested, and he did it in his own way. And so it comes back to that, the interest, and how you bring it out is how you bring it out. And isn't that the joy of watching telly? I love watching presenters that have a different style that I've never seen before, because it makes you realize, okay, we don't all have to be the same within production. We can all approach something as long as we've got those core values in a different way.
You're completely right. Like, it is that thing, like on Crimewatch, using that as an example, like we all do the same job, but we all come at it differently, which is really nice to see. With your presenting, obviously, like you said, your break was, I suppose, on Blue Peter, but like, how did it develop from there? I can't, like, in my head, you didn't go straight to presenting straight away. Like,
No.
what was that like transition like, and becoming a fully fledged presenter? Like, what were you learning?
It took years, to be honest. If I think I started work experience at BBC in Manchester in 2005, I started doing bits of presenting in 2010 to 11, and what we're in 2026 now. And I've probably been presenting full time for the last 10 years. It was real step by step. So the kind of bits and pieces that I was doing on Blue Peter was very, very ad hoc. And that was kind of alongside my day job, of being a researcher on the programme. And then the programme moved up to Manchester. So I moved up with Blue Peter and was an AP on Blue Peter. And within that time, working within CBBC, because I'd done bits and pieces on that programme, other productions within children's programming asked me to screen test for shows. So I ended up doing an art show called Totally Rubbish, which was basically making things from, old bits of rubbish. I did another show, which was a spin-off from Deadly 60 called Deadly Art, which was creating art inspired by what Steve Backshall, host of Deadly 60, saw when he was out on his travels. And these came about from producers asking me to go and screen test whilst I was kind of in the department. But also some of it as well, or kind of probably 50-50 really, was me actually going off my own back to speak to other people in the department. And not necessarily at that stage, it was still kind of dipping my toe in saying, I want to be a presenter, because I actually really loved my job in production. But it was asking for advice on, how do I do both? Is that a thing that people do? If I do more of this, am I going to be frowned upon? Because there weren't many people that I knew at the time that had started to kind of do presenting if they worked in production. It was like everybody has their lane. You do that, you do that. And am I going to be seen if I start doing this as someone that's slacking on this, So it was kind of teetering around, and it took having certain bosses to be very supportive of what I was doing. And that was also nurtured by me having open and honest conversations, and actually, to be fair, working over and above in my production job just to prove that, I could do both. So there would be times where, say, I did a travelogue show on CBBC called All Over the Place, where I would have a bit of time out to do that presenting show, and then I would come back to my production job and do AP on Blue Peter again. And for me, to be honest, it got to the point where I was spinning so many plates, and it felt like I was doing 2 full jobs at the same time. I remember sitting down with a couple of mates and my mum saying, I need to start having a long, hard think about what I want the next phase of my career to look like. And it does take that moment in your career sometimes to sit down, have a frank word with yourself, and maybe take a bit of a risk. Telly's so volatile. I think it's more volatile than ever. But at the same time, if you do have a passion and you believe in yourself, sometimes you do have to take that leap, which is hard at times. And for me, I'm thinking it's all very well and good taking a leap, but, I need to be able to pay my rent at the end of this month. You've got to be realistic with those risks that you're taking. So I continued to work in my production job. But what I was actively doing, every given opportunity, was thinking of the long game in terms of presenting. I knew at that point that it was something I loved doing. It wasn't just, I love presenting because it's in front of the camera and seeing myself on TV. If I'm completely honest, actually watching myself on TV, I remember the first time I saw myself on TV, I found it very, very difficult because I was just so self-critical. I just like, oh my God, how cringe. But what I realized is the joy that I would get from being out, hearing someone's story, getting to interview them and connect with people and be in places and spaces that I hadn't been before. And actually, it was less about me and me presenting and more about what I was learning from other people that was joyous, so joyous. And I just thought, I want to have more of this, but I need to think of this as a solid career. And with that comes longevity. So, for me, especially when I started doing bits and pieces in CBBC, I think I was in my 30s then, early 30s, and thinking, this is a game where, if you look at the presenters within CBBC now, they're young, they're more kind of the age of the CBBC audience. It's aging younger rather than kind of aging older.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of, if I want to stay in this field, I need to be looking at other areas outside of children's programming where I feel like I could have an impact and think more about actually the stories that matter to me. What is it that I want to have a voice on? What do I think I could bring to life? So in my own time, I would be contacting different producers and program makers from consumer programs, so outside of children's TV. So at the time, there was a program called Inside Out Northwest. It was a regional program, and it was like a mix between a news show but a bit more kind of like consumer watchdoggy. And I knew this lady kind of to say hi to from my time in Manchester, and I just went on the BBC system, found her email address and said, could I meet you for a coffee and a chat? These are my thoughts on what I'm thinking in terms of my career. I'd really like to delve more into reporting. And these are some of my ideas, basically, going in with actual. I never want to go into a space and expect somebody to just give me a job because I'm saying I'd like to be a presenter. You know, they probably don't know you from Adam. Even now, it's like, what am I able to offer them? What can I give them? Like, at least tell them what I'm interested in, what I'm passionate about. And 3 things that I think would be hot topics for consumer ideas, which is what I did. And we had a really good chat. And I think it must have taken probably another 6 to 9 months, probably even longer, of me kind of every so often getting back in touch with her and just sending her a top line of a thought or a comment on a VT that I'd seen on Inside Out Northwest that evening. Every so often I would kind of like drip, drip, drip feed. And eventually she contacted. I remember being sat and thinking, being just so disheartened because I didn't feel like I was getting anywhere, and being like, I've got to jack this in really. And getting a phone call from her saying, we've got a VT that we'd like you to do. And it was kind of, I think it was like road testing different meters and working with 2 families and having this kind of like consumer competition.
Yeah.
And we think you'd be good at it because you get to the heart of the families and spend a bit of time with them. Would you be up for doing it? And I have to say, probably doing that VT and being in a space that was kind of consumer rather than children was the catalyst for me that helped kind of unlock everything else that I've done within my career. So once I'd done 1 VT for them, I ended up doing a few more. This is again whilst I was still doing my day job within children's.
Wow.
To take leave to do the jobs. So, in the kind of, paid leave holiday days, I'd be literally spending my time doing extra work by doing these VTs. And it was when I had a bank of 3 or 4 VTs for them, I then approached the editor of Watchdog at the time, just for a chat. I always think sometimes it's good to ask to have a chat for advice rather than, as I said before, can you make me a TV presenter, please, on your program, to try and get on their radar. And again, over time, I ended up doing some VTs for them. And then I don't know how long it must have been, months and months, I got asked to be part of the new presenting lineup for Watchdog, which then was my kind of first BAM, kind of like prime time evening part of I was with Matt Allwright and Sophie Rayworth at the time. I still remember I was still working in production. I'd moved from CBBC to do an attachment to work as a producer in BBC Learning and events. I remember going down to do the live show for Watchdog of the evening and then getting the last train from Euston Station up to Hull to go and produce a BBC event in Hull.
Wow.
And I remember so distinctly being under one of the trestle tables because we'd set up something for the event and cleaning up all the mess under the trestle table. And this woman like lifting the sheet up and go, Michelle, is it Michelle? I was like, yeah, hi. Did I see you on Watchdog last night? I was like, yep, that's me. Hiya.
That's amazing.
But even then I was like, I still don't feel like I'm ready to take the leap because it still felt a bit fleeting, And then when I got from Watchdog, I got the call. Alex Jones went on maternity leave and I'd gone for a chat with the editor, Sandy Smith, at the time for the One Show because they asked me to do a couple of VTs for them, which actually came about from me, Matt Allwright and Sophie Rayworth going on the One Show to promote Watchdog. And then off the back, I was having a chat with some of the production team. And they said, oh, we'd love, to do some VTs on the One Show if you're interested. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And then I would make sure I'd keep in touch with them. Lovely to see you, yesterday, just to let you know. And here's some ideas that I was thinking of. So I ended up doing a couple of VTs for them. And then I remember going for a chat, as I said, with Sandy, the editor, and thinking it went really badly. I remember calling my mum and being like, oh my God, I don't know why. I just feel like that was the worst chat I've ever had. And I remember being in the office in Media City at my desk and getting a call from Sandy saying, we would like to offer you the host job on the One Show for Alex Jones' maternity role, which is 3 days every week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, for the next, I think it was 6 to 9 months, something like that. Wow. 6 months off. So I remember then I said yes, obviously. I put the phone on and thought, now's the time. Now's the time. I called my mom. I was like, this is what I've been offered. And it was such a big thing, to think, I'm leaving production. But for me personally, that was the moment where I felt like, okay, I can move to this next space now.
Yeah.
And focus 100% on this being my new career. And then it continued from there.
I think what's really amazing to hear from you is something that I've heard on other people say, like in the industry, but also on this podcast, is just always keeping in contact with people and never just like resting on hoping that it comes to you. I think that's really interesting that as a presenter from that side, people just assume that, like you say, you get given it, I suppose. But that's not necessarily how it happened. And at the beginning, you've worked for it, and like you say, you were still doing your production job. And I think that's really, really good to hear, is just how you made that transition. And out of curiosity, just because you seem to love production, like, would you ever go back to production? Would that ever be something that you'd look at?
Absolutely. I would, I'd like there to be some kind of like hybrid model. I mean, I spend a lot of my time developing ideas and not even just for me, it's like thinking of things that I'm interested in. And I've even thought of setting up my own production company or becoming an agent, one of the two, as a side hustle. But yeah, absolutely. A production is such an important part of telly, obviously. And I know from colleagues that I've got who are also presenters, the ones that have worked in production, it's really interesting. There is a bit of a difference there. And actually you start to realize that there are quite a few presenters that have come, like dotted around, that have come from that production background. And again, it just highlights that passion for telly, and your kind of mind works in a bit of a different way, because you're thinking 360 in a way. Not to say that presenters that haven't come from a production background don't, but I just think I find that there's a level of respect there for me for production.
I suppose it's that understanding.
To it, understanding, yeah.
Yeah, like I get it from a different perspective. Like, I can always tell someone that's been a runner, because there's a different level of understanding to someone that hasn't. And I
Yes.
do get what you mean. I think it's not this, it's just you get a fuller picture, I suppose,
Yeah.
of what you're doing. Yeah, definitely.
To be able to understand what every little bit means and how it
Yeah.
brings the whole picture together. And I do think, thankfully, there are less egos within the kind of presenting sphere, because I think back in the day, it was almost like presenters were put on this pedestal and revered as if they're some gods, and you can't look them in the eye, or say. That's how I felt, especially when I worked on certain productions as a runner when I first started. And I don't think there should be that kind of divide between presenters and production. Yeah. And that's why when there can be fluidity between both, I think it's really good both ways. It's that greater understanding, and there's so much more that can be brought to the table.
Yeah, no, I completely get what you mean, and it just makes it not nicer, but just I suppose, easier place to work.
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit about the technical side of things, being a presenter. My friend, you probably know him from Morning Live, but my friend Tommy Cowell, I sent.
Called me earlier, actually. I was
Actually.
I was like, Tommy, can't speak to you now because I'm just about to jump on a podcast. I should have said it was your podcast.
He's done this podcast before. He's a big fan, so he'll probably be listening. So hi, Tommy. But he suggested these questions, and I think it's really important for people that want to be a presenter. Is how do you deal with like the comms from gallery whilst also speaking to camera and that side of things? Like, you're obviously trying to present and not show that there's people in your ear. I've sat in the gallery. I've seen how it can be and what you're hearing. How do you deal with that, and how hard was it to get used to?
I think it's practice. And I know to this date, there are, there's two kind of sides to that, especially with live TV. You can have open talkback or switch. Open talkback is when you hear everything within the gallery. Switch is when you don't hear anything. You literally wait for a producer to feed into you, and then they will give you instructions. Now, it's a personal preference, but for me, I wanted to make sure that I train myself on having open talkback. And that's probably because I'm a bit of a control freak at times, and I actually feel safer when I can hear more noise. And you get a few seconds warning, because if everything suddenly went quiet in a busy gallery where you tend to hear a lot, you know that something's coming down the line that you'll need to be able to react to. So it's good to have that kind of skill. In order to get that skill, it takes practice, and it's almost kind of like you have to separate two sides of your brain. And it is, I remember the first time I did it, it was like, whoa, okay. As humans, we're not used to having to kind of really be laser focused on doing one thing whilst having so many other things going on at the same time. It is a skill. But I used to practice in front of the mirror. So I'd read a script, or I'd read like a passage from a book, but then I'd also have like the TV on really loud, or I'd have something that I'd probably also want to focus on, like my favorite song. And so I'd start reading something from a book and be trying to focus on the words that I was delivering in front of the mirror. But then I'd also be trying to every so often just tap into, okay, that's my favorite song. I know the chorus is coming up in a little while. Can you remember like this section of it or this section? So it's like a muscle. It was slowly but surely trying to train my brain to be focused on this, but also pay attention to this, but then also zone out of that and then remain focused on that. And another thing I used to do was practice in front of the mirror doing a piece to camera and like focus on one spot, but then like move around the room and be looking at loads of different things at the same time, but still trying to be consistent with what I was saying. And for some reason, that again, that kind of training of the muscle to be focused on one thing, but allowing your brain to also pay attention to a lot of other things that are going on, slowly but surely start. It's like kind of patting your head and rubbing your belly. Slowly but surely, it was getting used to using that different muscle. And also it's within a gallery situation, it's really zoning in on what you do need to listen to and what you don't need to listen to. Because there's certain things there's kind of a list of priorities in your head of what's important. And that's where the communication between a producer and a presenter is key. Because if you have a producer that is on it, even in that kind of open environment where everyone's talking, they will still make sure that they only really speak to you when they need to talk to you. And also they will kind of train themselves to understand different presenters, because some presenters like to be spoken to kind of all the time, and even to the point of really good first item there, well done, after that. Or it might be during the item when you're having a conversation with someone and the next question is this. Or it might be drop question 5, let's go straight to the end, or, we're losing. So some presenters, I don't mind that. I quite like having, because you kind of feel like you're in synergy together. You're in that moment together and you're kind of having a conversation, but not having a conversation. You've almost got more clarity, even though it feels like there's a lot of sound. But again, that kind of thing, it's, for people getting into TV, you're never going to get that straight away. And it's something that changes depending. I find it even now, like 10 years into it, when you work with different people, it will be different, so it's kind of, as an individual, figuring out what you think you might like. Are you the type of person that feels like they would like to have that kind of ongoing communication with somebody, or someone that wants to just kind of have the key messages? And then you slowly take it from there. And then you kind of start to find your feet of what you like, what works, what doesn't. And I think it's also dependent on the type of show. Like, with Crimewatch, when we're doing some really intense interviews, especially with victims, sometimes it's better to have silence in a gallery, and if you've done your prep, like I always make sure, I do my prep, but when I'm doing interviews with victims, I don't want to be looking at my cue card on my iPad once, even if everything was to change. I want to know that case inside out and have a bank of questions in my head. So all I'm really relying on in that moment are the timings, and I'm just listening to what that person is saying to me and reacting and making sure that I'm keeping them safe in that space.
Like going back to that thing of just wanting to having that interest in people. You want to build that connection. It goes back to that.
That is it. On so many different levels. On the person that you're interviewing live in studio, but also building the connection with the gallery, you know, and the production team. And it's again it's a 360 thing. And when you have got that in all aspects, in front of and behind the camera, with your co-host, with your producer, you know, with the program as a whole, that is when things do just feel perfectly aligned. And I do think it leads to just a better show.
Just one other technical thing that like interests me, because I don't know how you can do it, is, for instance, when we on Crimewatch and we do the rehearsals before anyone else is in, and we stood there and you having to read the auto cue, that completely blows my mind how you can do that. Because how do you just focus? I mean, it's probably similar to what you just said about like listening to the gallery and stuff, but like, just how do you make reading what's there seem natural?
It's a really interesting question, that, because I still feel like I could improve on that. And I think I've noticed, like, you know, if I got too in my head about the fact that I'm reading on an auto cue, then it would all go to pot. Because I know at times when I have done that, that's when I fluffed my lines, when I'm overthinking it. The times when it's sometimes best is, obviously you've done your prep, so you've read the script the night before, you know what's coming, and then you go in and it's almost like you just kind of want to let go of everything, look at the screen. This is for me personally, and just be the calmest you possibly can, I find, and then just look and read. Just look and read. At times when I've, for whatever reason it may be, kind of felt flustered and fluffing on lines, and it's really difficult, especially with autocue, because if you mess up one line or one sentence, then you get that in your head, and then sometimes it's really hard to come back from, and then you start messing up the rest of the thing. But one thing that's helped me is trying not to think too far ahead on the autocue, and literally sometimes I will look at one individual word, hello, welcome to the show, and I'll compartmentalize it and literally just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for some reason, for me, it helps. And what also helps is just to slow it down. I think sometimes if there's a fear of or an anxiety around reading autocue, which is understandable, there's a tendency I see sometimes in people to want to rush it. You start it and you've realized you've not made any mistakes. You start to talk faster and faster and faster, and you're just hoping to get to the end of it. Whereas actually, again, just kind of being present and being mindful and staying in the moment and slowing it down really helps. Because the more sometimes you slow something down, for some reason it feels a bit more like it is a conversation, and you're also just giving your brain that little bit more time to catch up with itself and read. Obviously not to a point where, you know, everyone at home can tell your eyes are going, hello, well, program, and it's so freaking slow. But it's those kind of like nuanced bits that really help me, just trying to stay present, focusing on one word at a time, and taking it slowly.
I'm definitely the one that when I'm doing the rehearsals, I'm guilty of speeding and going really, really quick. I'm just like, just read the whole thing and this will be over as soon as possible. Yeah. Out of curiosity, it's just something that came to my head. Obviously, you've done reporting, you obviously present now. Is there like a difference between, say, like doing a reporting on a VT or presenting, say, Crimewatch Live or Morning Live? Is there a difference, or would you say it's very, very similar for someone that would be looking at it?
No, I think there's a real difference actually. I mean, presenting in studio to say I was doing a VT for Morning Live the other day. Well, the basic kind of things are, you know, presenting a VT, you've got a bit more time, right? So you'll ask a series of questions, but then you most probably will ask them again because they'll do a wide shot or they'll do reverses. If there's only one camera, then you might have to pick up your questions for the camera to turn around and do them from a different angle. So you have a bit more time. You might have a bit more time. But like the other day, for example, we got to the location and the contributor that we were filming with was late. His train was delayed. So we flipped the schedule and the director was like, why don't we bang out your pieces to camera now and get them done? And then we've got more time for when the contributor comes. So in that type of scenario, you almost have to treat it a bit as if it was live, because we had a set amount of time for me to essentially nail these pieces to camera straight away. So even though you're not live, there are elements of it where you still want to go in almost not more prepared, but as prepared as you would do for a live broadcast, because things change all the time. I think sometimes what's different on location is you might have a bit more kind of setup time to chat to contributors. You know, sometimes on a live studio day, it's geared up and it's gone before you know it. Everything just, as you know, happens so quickly. But I like those opportunities on a film day where you can just take a bit of time to really get to know the people that you're talking to. And we try to do it, a bit on Crimewatch, but when you're in a studio show and you've got so many different guests to interview, the time pre-studio that the presenter can have with them can get quite slimmed down. But on a location shoot, it can be a bit more focused on just you and that person.
Yeah.
And that can be a really lovely experience because you can build a different type of bond. There's that space to be able to do that, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. I mean, my perspective, I think working because I've done both films and studio on Crimewatch, I think from that perspective as well, it's still very different, very similar, but also very different. Like you say, you're building different kinds of relationships with people. I've got just a few more questions for you, but like, just what is the hardest part of your job and what have you learned from it?
I think, if I'm completely honest, one of the hardest things I would say is you've got to have thick skin, right? Because your face isn't always going to fit, and you could work really hard 100% of the time and still not get the job and still not get the next job, because actually there's somebody else that's just as good or better or not as good that's going to get the job, and you haven't got any control over that. So things don't necessarily work in that linear kind of process of, if you work really hard, you will get X job. You might get it, but someone else might get it. That's kind of how telly works. That's also the joy of telly, that you've got so many different faces and voices, and sometimes yours might not fit for that role, that program, no matter how much you want it. So not letting that, I mean, people say, oh, don't take it personal. Well, of course it's personal because it's you. Do you know what I mean? It's you as a person. So of course you're going to take it personally. It's also a part of the job. And where that one job wasn't, another job will be. I mean, the amount of times that's happened to me within this industry, and, at the start, it will break me. I'd be like, well, that's it. My career's over. And then something that I wouldn't even be expecting, or an email would come through from a chat that I'd have with someone months or years ago that I'd put to the back of my mind and hadn't thought of again, would suddenly turn into a brand new series, So it can be tricky, but you've got to keep that tenacity and keep sowing those seeds if you're passionate enough.
I think what I'm really appreciating talking to you now is seeing the similarities between what you do and what I do, between that on screen and behind the scenes. Is very similar in the fact that like you say, is just like, even though I've worked on Crimewatch quite regularly, I still come to the end of that series and I'm like, I don't have a job.
Yeah.
And it's that thing of you've always got to continuously put yourself out there.
Yes.
But similarly to you, is like, I was at a point, just as I went freelance, I'd left my full-time job and I got a job and then didn't have anything. So ended up having to go back and work. I think I worked in the Odeon and applied for Bargain Hunt. And I thought, this is amazing. I've interviewed on my birthday. Surely I'm going to get it. And I didn't get it. But from that, a month later, I got the call for Crimewatch. So it is that thing of like, things don't always happen the way you think they're going to happen, but you'll eventually get there.
Yeah.
But it's really, I think it's really nice to hear that it's the same for you in a way, that we're all in this same box. Going from your hardest part of the job, like, what is your most fun part of the job? Do you have a favorite memory? You've done so much. I mean, I enjoy looking at the archive when I'm having to go through Crimewatch stuff, and I just see all you climbing a wall. Or there was one of my favorites is when you've got the dog thing around your arm.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
There's so many
moments. You know what? It would be the variety. I mean, if I think of when I did Crimewatch Roadshow, from abseiling off a wall. I mean, I've worn so many different types of kit over the years on Crimewatch, from mountain rescue to mounted unit to RNLI to, I mean, you name it. But that was amazing. And to be able to do those things live, that it was a real learning curve for me. I remember we were at Gravesend in Kent, and it's a big training facility for officers, and the whole thing, they had me in a big riot scenario where they were petrol bombing me. I'm trying to listen to the timings in my ear to feed back to studio. We're live on location, so the signal's kind of up and down and God knows what, so I could hardly hear anything. Then I inhale a whole heap of whatever it was from the petrol bomb fumes, and I'm trying to relay my message back to Ralph, back to you in the studio. It was all going on. But when I reflect back on that, I just think, what an experience. And it's mad, because anywhere I go where I'm traveling and I saw an RNLI boat on the Thames the other day, and one of their massive rig boats, it was like zooming along past the embankment. And I thought, I've been on one of them. Even going back to when I worked in CBBC, and I worked on all over the place. We did all over the place Europe. We did all over the place America, all over the place Asia. Got to tour around Sri Lanka. Got to tour Tasmania, Victoria, Switzerland, all these places, Michigan. I remember standing next to a lighthouse on Lake Superior in America, and I had a little moment, and I just started doing presenting then, and I got so overwhelmed, and I just started crying because I just felt so grateful for being able to have these experiences. I did the same in a toilet at the one show. I had to go and watch Kong Skull Island because I was interviewing Samuel L. Jackson and Tom Hiddleston. So I had to go and watch the movie before it was released. I remember going to this like bougie screening in Soho, and I went to the loo and I just stood in the toilet and started crying. I was like, I can't believe like what am I doing? But I reflect on those times and think they're real highlights for me because they're all so different, but it's not lost on me how much I enjoy doing what I'm doing and really want to continue for as long as I possibly can doing it.
Well, hopefully you get to, because it just sounds amazing. What bits of advice can you share? I suppose your top 3 bits of advice to someone wanting to get in presenting that you wish you known at the start. But also, I suppose, as soon as you've got that knowledge of production, what advice would you give to someone wanting to get into production as well?
Yeah, I think, well, starting with presenting, I think it's important to, first of all, take the time to understand what it is you think that you can offer. And that starts with, what are you interested in? What are you curious about? And there are so many things you can do online these days with social media. You could, like a segment on Morning Live, we do Vox Pops where we go out into, the streets of Manchester and ask people about a subject matter that's of interest within the news. If people are really inspired to want to do presenting, there are things that you can actively start to do for yourself to just try and hone your skills, or even find out a bit more of that's the type of thing that you would be interested in doing. So it's definitely going back to being curious and figuring out for you what that curiosity is, but also what type of presenter you want to be. I think a really important one is not watch other presenters. I think that's very important, but don't ever feel like you need to be them. Really focus on what it is you can bring to the table, what it is that makes you unique, because that's what's going to give you longevity. That's what's going to carry you through. If you try and be someone else, you're going to get found out. So, no one can kind of keep that up. Keep driven, have that passion, evolving, and keeping on pushing is so important. And I think, one piece of bad advice I got when I first started in the industry was that I needed to find a niche and stick to it and not veer away from it. And I just don't think, going back to psychology, I don't think human beings are made to be like that. I think we are complex, crazy, beautiful creatures, and we can have a lot of different interests and have a voice around a lot of different things. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that if you're mad passionate about science that you shouldn't go and veer to be a science expert or a science presenter, but it doesn't mean that you can't also have a voice and an interest in different things. So again, it's kind of thinking about what that could be. And in terms of production, some of my best friends are friends that I had from working in production, and what I admire about them and why they're still working in the industry is because they network and they talk to other people. You know, they ask questions and they come up with ideas, and they just keep pushing. And you know, some of them will have times where they're out of work for a bit, but it's like you were saying, you know, you you applied for a place on Bargain Hunt, you went for the interview, you're constantly thinking about how your skills might align for another job. So you constantly have to keep putting yourself out there and also skill yourself up. Try and think of yourself as somebody that can do everything these days.
It's true.
If you can use a camera, if you can edit, if you can write scripts as well as present, you know, if you can do all those things, then it's a numbers game, isn't it? There's more chance of people hiring you for one, if not all of them.
Yeah, no, it is. You just got to put yourself out there, put yourself in
Yeah.
them situations, and
Yeah.
and good things happen. Like I 10 years ago was a really timid person that would cry standing in front of people. The thought of to then be behind the scenes in Crimewatch and briefing people and talking to yourself and Rav about the stuff that we've got coming up.
Yeah.
It's about putting yourself in them situations and just seeing the best thing come out of it, really, I suppose, isn't it?
Exactly.
I
Very well
mean,
said.
it's been great chatting to you. I've got one final question, and this is, I think, the most important because it means I get to get something new to watch, basically. But what are you enjoying and watching or listening to podcasts at the minute?
Oh my God. So I'm really into Audible books at the minute. Just because I've got a young baby, my life is spent on buggy walks. So I put one earphone in, and when she finally goes to sleep on the buggy walk, I think, right, I'm going to listen to. I like a murder mystery, to be honest. So I've been listening to one called Beautiful Ugly by Alice Sweeney, which has been cracking. And then for my sins, I've been pretty obsessed with Married at First Sight Australia. There's a new season of The Real Housewives of Rhode Island, which I've been loving. Watched the first 2 episodes, very, very good. But then I love Silent Witness. Silent Witness is a good one. The Morning Show,
Love.
so good. Oh, and Slow Horses. I was really late to the table with Slow Horses,
I
and
started that last year.
it's so good.
Yeah,
Gary Oldman, what an amazing actor he is.
phenomenal
It's
series.
so good. So yeah, those are my highlights, I would say.
Well, thank you so much for chatting to me, Michelle. It's been great just like listening
You.
to you talk about, well, just getting to learn a bit more about you, I suppose, and your career. It's been really interesting. So, no, I really appreciate it. And for anyone listening, watching, I really hope it's helped you as well. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.